So now let's create this hashed password variable and assign to it the hashed password that we saved on the table, on the users table inside our database instance. So what we want to do right now is compare this hashed password with the password that was provided by the user, and in order to do that we are going to use the bcrypt packages compare hash and password method. So the method accepts two parameters. The first parameter is the hashed password, and the second parameter is the password that you want to compare with the hashed password. So going into the function definition, we see here that the function returns nil on success or an error on failure. And the parameters that you pass into this method should be slices of bytes. So we have to convert the password that we pass from the client to a slice of byte together with the hashed password before passing each into the method. So when passing the parameters into the method, here you create this empty square brackets and you write byte, and into the brackets you pass hashed password. Again, you do the same thing for the plain text password. So what you're doing here is you're basically changing the string values to slice of bytes that are expected by the method. Also make sure to uncomment the password on line 144 because now we are going to use it. And on line 159, where you have the assignment for hashed password, make sure you have the shorthand variable declaration syntax. You need to add a colon before the equal sign. So next, since we know that the compare hash and password method returns nil on success and error on failure, we need to assign the entire method code to this error variable and check if the error is not nil. Then we need to send a message to the user stating that the password is not valid, otherwise we can proceed. So here on error.message you assign invalid password and you pass the status and the error into respond with error and return out of the function. So if there is no error, then we need to invoke our generate token function that we created earlier to generate the token, and into generate token we pass the user variable, and this should give us two returned values, the token and the error. And if the error is not nil, then we need to exit with log.fatal, otherwise we proceed. So now we need to respond to the client with the status and the token. So on the response writer, invoke write header and pass http.status_ok into the method, and also uncomment the JWT variable that you created earlier and comment it because we're gonna need it now. And on the JWT variable that we created from the JWT struct or the JWT model, we have this field called token. So write jwt.token and assign to this field the token variable that you created when you generated the token. And finally, invoke the response JSON functions that you created earlier and pass the response writer and the JWT variable into it as parameters. So now we are done with the coding part. It's time to test our implementation. So go to your terminal and run your program. Do go run main.go and open Postman. And on Postman, make sure your endpoint is /login and the action is post. And inside the body, add the credentials that you created earlier when you signed up and hit send. And the response you get is an object with a token attribute and a JWT value, and the status you see is 200, which means success. So basically, to recap what we've done, we created these three variables, user, JWT, and error, and we decoded the request body and mapped the values to the user variable. So the fields inside the user variable, such as email and password, would have the values that you send from the client, but we also did some server-side validation for user email and password. We checked if the email existed, and if it did not exist, we responded with an error message and the status byte request status code. And we also did the same for the password. And we queried the database for the user record, and we did that by passing the user's email, because the user's email is a unique value that can be used as a unique identifier or as an ID in this case. And query row returned to us a row, and we scanned the contents of the row and basically mapped those values to our user variable. And we also did some error checking, and if for example the email did not exist, we responded with an error message that states the user does not exist. Then we did a comparison of the hashed password that we retrieved from the table and the password that the client passed, and we invoked the compare hash and password method of bcrypt and passed those values into this method, and the method returned nil if the comparison was successful, otherwise it returned an error. On success though, we generated our token from the generate token function we created earlier. And we finally used the response JSON function to return the JWT to the client.